This morning, we have Dr. Hilary Snapp, who is the Division Chief of Audiology at the University of Miami. She did her training at the University of Florida for a bachelor's degree, and she did her audiology doctorate at Rush University. And following that, she did a PhD at the University of Miami, where she is now. Dr. Snapp, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'll go ahead and get my screen up. Give me just a second. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm also thankful to all of you on the West Coast. I know it's an early morning, so I'm appreciative you've chosen to share it with me today. So we'll be talking about spatial hearing in the single-sighted listener. This is my lab where we study spatial perception in impaired and normal hearing listeners. And, I've been very fortunate in my career to have the opportunity to consistently be surrounded by incredibly bright and talented individuals. And these people here on the screen are certainly no exception. And it's their work that really has built the foundation of all the things that we're doing and all the exciting work to come. So I'm so appreciative of them and the opportunity to continue to collaborate and work with them. In our lab, we're particularly interested in understanding the behaviors listeners employ to leverage cues to improve both their speech perception and localization abilities. One area that has been an interest of mine for a long time, obviously, is studying of the monoral hearing listener. So single-sided deafness is quite simply normal hearing in one ear and severe to profound hearing loss in the impaired ear. And so the very typical auditory profile that you would see is this right here with normal hearing in one ear defined as typically less than 20 dB, with a severe to profound hearing loss in the other ear, typically more than 70 dB, with no word recognition ability, warranting it unaidable. Now, definitions of this can vary and often include more asymmetric forms of hearing loss, which may look something a little bit more like this. But in most of these cases, these patients are either unwilling to utilize a monaural hearing aid to facilitate that ear, or simply just do not adopt or accept it. Now, there's recent studies finally coming out trying to describe the prevalence of SSD, most recently by K. Revest et al., showing that this is actually, somewhat a low prevalence, but also starts to indicate that perhaps women have a slightly higher prevalence than men. And we know that the etiology of single-sided deafness is pretty widespread, includes a number of different conditions, but most commonly it's idiopathic. And this is an important thing to consider in these patients because often this will come on suddenly. And so their experience is really a dramatic shift in their ability to hear and process acoustic information. Now, traditionally, for many, many years, decades and decades and decades, we really didn't consider single-sided deafness to be a major issue for listeners. The concept was one normal hearing ear was enough. But we now know well that SSD can really lead to significant psychosocial impacts. Indeed, many patients will adapt well without any intervention. And this is particularly true for those who've been monaural listeners for some time. But still, there are also many patients who will report everyday difficulties and a level of psychological distress that seems to be disproportionate to their audiogram. Others report issues with auditory fatigue and listening effort that's also disproportionate to their auditory findings. And this is most often reported in the spatial hearing domain. Researchers also suggest that the disability and handicap in some SSD listeners can actually meet or exceed those with bilateral hearing loss. And all of this collectively can lead to a number of other trailing effects that reduce performance at work or in academic settings. Now, we know that SSD, there's emerging evidence and growing evidence to suggest that there's also central effects from this. Animal models and brain mapping studies show reorganization of tonotopic frequency maps in the auditory cortex, confirming that the auditory system has the capacity to undergo plasticity changes. And interestingly, this is thought to maybe increase the listening effort and cognitive load in SSD listeners, as studies have shown frontal lobe recruitment that can be observed during auditory tasks. Importantly, the loss of the unilateral input in SSD has been associated with spatial reorganization of the auditory cortex in both hemispheres, which leads us to think that this plasticity change may actually account for some of these hearing deficits in this population and the associated handicaps that seem to precede what can be explained by the peripheral dysfunction alone. But more simply and fundamentally, our sense of hearing is particularly important in connecting us to the world. It orients us in space and helps us to navigate its complexities. And so hearing really is so integral to how we interact with the world around us, how we perceive the world around us. So what is it that makes two people with the same condition, the same auditory profile, have very different needs and different experiences? And so this is one of the things that we're really interested in exploring in the lab. Hearing, like all of our senses, defines our lived experiences. And so while many of us may share some of these experiences, like singing and clapping at a birthday party, we also uniquely experience the world. And hearing, it could be argued, is one of the most influential in these experiences. And so the loss of hearing can lead to a number of challenges: loss of productivity, social isolation, and we now know even changes in cognition. But fortunately for us, science can dramatically transform, even in a very short period of time, what it means to have a disability. And so our field is a great example of this. In 1965 is when we first saw the real treatment approach for single-sided deafness, the cross hearing aid. But interestingly, we went about 40 years before there was any more innovation, right? So we had the cross hearing aid come into play, and then there was not really much activity. And for those of you who are less familiar with the cross hearing aid, this is the idea, the configuration where a microphone is placed on the ear, and a signal was routed to a hearing aid ward in the better ear using a wired configuration. But this was not readily adopted or accepted by these listeners, mostly because of the acoustical limitations. So at this time, it required a very large occluding ear mold to be placed into the ear, limiting the ability to actually use the monoral hearing ear effectively. And so this was largely rejected. But fast forward to 2001, and we see that there is a FDA approval for implantable bone conduction hearing devices. And so this really changed the landscape, whereas we'd had no innovation in treatment for SSD for many, many years, and most patients were going untreated. All of a sudden, we see a surge in treatment. And really, this is the same thing as rerouting, just using a different type of transmission style. So here we're implanting a percutaneous abutment into the temporal bone behind the deafened ear and attaching a processor. And instead of rerouting it to the normal hearing ear using a hearing aid configuration, it's sending the signal transcranially using bone conduction. And so the benefit of this is that there's no more occlusion of the normal hearing ear. So patients are able now to access sound from the deafened side, but also able to continue to use their good monaural hearing. But in both of these situations, this rerouting does not provide any direct stimulation to that deafened ear or binaural input. So, we took off with a charge. We started seeing this huge increase in treatment, but then indeed we started to learn that patients were maybe rolling off in their willingness to adopt and accept this device. And so the thought started to be, maybe this is because of that lack of binaural input. But the important thing that bone conduction devices did, implantable bone conduction devices, is it really triggered a spike in research and innovation in this space, and an interest in treating these patients, and an awareness of their disability that might be associated with their hearing loss, leading us to where we are today, where we have cochlear implants, which provide direct stimulation to that ear, approved in 2019 for the indication of single-sided deafness. But let's circle back for a second and review what we understand about the auditory neuroscience of binaural hearing. Spatial perception is multisensory and multifaceted. So the auditory system plays a particularly important role in helping to map where we are in space. Space is complex. It depends on our interaction with signals that are dynamically changing in terms of frequency spectrum, time, and level. And the more complex the listening environment, the more these signals are going to interact and overlap. So the important thing to think about is that the experience of a listener is not purely about detection as we measure with an audiogram. It's not just about awareness of the sound. It's really about how we manage these complex interactions so that we can provide meaning to these signals. And here's where binaural hearing really comes into play and becomes very important to provide us certain advantages. The integration of the acoustic information from both ears is essential for spatial hearing. It serves to provide critical information for speech processing, localization, segregation of auditory inputs and streams, and the perception of fused sounds. But importantly, binaural hearing gives rise to a wide array of auditory phenomena due to the integration and processing of differences in arrival time and intensity between the two ears. So these interaural difference cues are critical. They're frequency and direction dependent. And this is mostly due to the acoustic head shadow, or the shadow that's created by the head, as you can see here on the right, which acts as a physical barrier to the sounds, resulting in both an attenuation and a delay in the signal at the ear that's farthest from the source. Low frequency sounds are characterized by longer wavelengths, and so they're well detected due to their ability to easily wrap around the head. Whereas high-pitched sounds or high-frequency sounds are characterized by shorter wavelengths and therefore diffracted by the head. And so these are very important concepts as we think about SSD listeners that we're going to continue to reference during the talk. The acoustic head shadowing also varies according to not only the frequency, but the position of the head. So for example, there's no difference for a signal, no timing difference or level difference for a signal directly in front of or behind the listener. As with timing differences, level differences are a frequency dependent cue. And so another important feature of this is that the level difference will increase as a function of frequency, reaching as high as a 20 dB of attenuation at the ear farthest from the source for high frequency sounds. But importantly, the head shadow effect is a physical phenomenon which serves to benefit binaural listeners. Specifically, sounds arriving at ears from different locations in space allow a listener to take advantage of spatially separated sounds to improve the signal to noise ratio at the nearer ear. Binaural summation and squelch of competing noise also occurs with binaural processing of amplitude phase differences between the two ears. So squelch is the ability on the left to combine the noise at the ear with the poor SNR with the noise from the ear with a more favorable signal to noise ratio. And so through this process, the brainstem is able to compare the differences in timing and amplitude between the two ears to give us a binaural advantage of squelch of 1.5 to 2.5 dB. Whereas summation is when there's an increase in the perceived loudness of the signal when presented binaurally. And the binaural advantage of this is thought to be around 3 dB. So while these dB changes or dB benefits are somewhat small, collectively they contribute to an increased ease of listening. Bronkhorst and Plopp suggested that level differences are used to ID the ear with the best signal to noise ratio, allowing a listener to focus on a source. Whereas Whitman and Kistler showed that given conflicting information, ITD dominates over the ILD. So what happens with a monaural listener? Complete loss of hearing in one ear significantly disrupts these cues and limits our ability to extract meaning from the cues. But with the introduction of cochlear implants for single-sided deafness, an opportunity for providing some binaural input exists. But the treatments continue to remain limited, and we're going to explore this through some of the studies that we've done and others have done over time, looking at spatial perception and the ability to integrate these cues using an electrical input with an acoustic input. So let's take a look at what the experience is for an SSD listener. As monaural listeners, they are left to rely on the normal hearing ear to process all of the acoustic information that's coming in. So they lose the ability under this condition to segregate spatially separated streams of sound, or to take advantage, when we're talking about the head shadow effect and the binaural hearing benefits of the separated signals in these complex environments. But this is further complicated by the reduced access to high frequency speech cues at the deafened ear. This is a result of that acoustic head shadow. Remember that the high frequency sounds are diffracted by the head, so they don't wrap around to the hearing ear side. So as an example, if we look at the comparison of the head shadow and pinna filtering for the words hat versus the word sat when presented at the deafened ear on the right, spectrograms and sound waveforms show that the high frequency speech components are attenuated on the hearing side, erasing the unique informational marks that differentiate these words from one another. So the frequency information on the hearing side clearly shows that each word conserves the main speech formats, but has lost those unique informational marks that makes it singular from one another. And the ambiguity of this diminishes an SSD listener's ability to extract meaning from the sound. And so this is one of the core things that directly contributes to high levels of handicap and disability reported in this population, particularly once you start to introduce a competing noise. So let's look at head shadow and how SSD affects listeners under different listening configurations. So here we're looking at some combined data from different data sets that we have. You're looking at the signal to noise ratio required in order for a listener to understand 50% correct. So this is a threshold measure. The lower on the graph, the better they're doing. And what we're doing is looking at different listening configurations. So when speech and noise are co-located, when speech is in the front, noise is presented from behind. When speech is directed at the good ear and noise is at the deafened ear, this is their easiest listening condition, versus when speech is directed at the deafened ear and noise is masking the good ear, this is their most challenging listening condition. And so these are common two-speaker setups you might see in the clinical environment. And when we look at unaided performance for the SSD listener, what you'll quickly see is that across these different listening configurations, depending on where the speech and the noise are located, they require different SNRs in order to hear what's being said in competing noise. And so we pause and think about how this listener might behave in a restaurant, for example, with multiple talkers. You can imagine that they might have to employ a lot of behavioral compensatory mechanisms in order to stay engaged in the conversation, constantly turning to try to improve the signal to noise ratio. And clearly we see that the largest deficit in these listeners is, again, when the speech is directed at their deafened ear and noise is interfering with the good ear hearing. When we put rerouting devices on either a cross or a bone conduction device, what we see is that this largely improves, right? With the exception of when speech is directed at the good ear, we see a slight deficit here in that condition. But when we look at the overall pattern, we see that now the SNR required in order to understand 50% has somewhat equalized a little bit. So it's not perfect, but you can imagine that this might create some reduction in effort if they're able to maintain a similar SNR regardless of where the talker is relative to the noise. And so we could utilize this information to maybe think about what the minimum SNR is needed in these listeners when using a device, or what do we need to endeavor to have these devices do? What type of SNR do we need to them to overcome to provide a more equal listening experience regardless of the environment? Now, when we look at the SSD plus CI users, what we see is a very similar pattern with two exceptions. Where the rerouting listeners are losing something in the best ear listening condition, the CI listeners are able to maintain that good performance. But in the most challenging situation, the cochlear implant seems to provide a little bit more gain over rerouting for deaf ear listening. But binaural hearing is not or binaural hearing cues are not the only thing that we're utilizing for our spatial hearing. Monoral spectral cues are also incredibly important. These are high frequency cues that use the time delay between the direct and pinna reflected sound to provide information about where we are in space. The figure here is showing the pinna gains. And what we've learned through several studies is that the auditory system's ability to adapt to the lack of binaural cues to preserve spatial hearing abilities as much as possible is pretty remarkable. And this process is achieved by reweighting the available cues to exploit the location-dependent monaural cues. And so a growing body of research points to the ability of monaural listeners to reweight these physical cues to improve their spatial hearing abilities, even in the absence of treatment. So what about localization performance and binaural and the monaural listener? So localization and elevation is supported by spectral pinnacues, but localization and azimuth is very dependent on the interval timing and level differences between the two ears. And so this is Seba Asili in our lab. He's the acoustical engineer who does a lot of this research and this work and designed a lot of the lab. And what you can see here is that he is using head orientation to locate where the sound is in space. So as I mentioned before, we are particularly interested in the behaviors listeners employ to enable rapid identification of a sound source and the ability to respond to very subtle changes in their environment. And so using these more reflexive orienting behaviors, we find and believe to be more informative because it removes the top-down processing, the executive functioning associated with something like pushing a button pad, the decision processing that's there. So Seba built this custom head tracker, which detects the velocity and acceleration and the positioning of these movements relative to the source to give us very accurate information about how somebody is localizing in space. So let's look at some of the localization studies from others. This is a study by Dorman et al., one of the early localization studies comparing performance across a number of listeners. Orienting you to the graph, what we have here is RMS error on the y-axis. So the lower the error, the better the performance. And as you can see, our normal hearing listeners are indeed doing very well with localization as we would expect. But when we move to single-sided listeners, we see also what you would expect is that there's a significant deviation from normal. But on top of this, there's also a lot of variability that we don't see in the normal hearing listeners, right? And many of them are performing at or above chance, meaning they're simply guessing. And this is commonly what you see reported in the literature. But we are interested really, again, in studying those behaviors. So instead of just looking at the averaged error across the entire hemifield, we can look at how a patient or a listener is responding at each a target or sound source point, right? So if we look here on the x-axis, this is representing where the sound is presented in space and a sound arc as demonstrated on the left here. And on the y-axis is their actual response. So if a target is presented and they're responding accurately, what you would expect to see across the azimuthal plane is perfect performance represented by this diagonal line. But when we look at our single-sided listeners, this is data from some of our SSD listeners using bone conduction and cross devices, we see that a very typical behavioral pattern, which is they're biasing all their responses to the better hearing ear. We also see that even though they're aided, there's no real benefit of these devices as we expect, because again, they're not getting those important binaural timing and level cues to improve their performance. So let's circle back to this Dorman paper again. So remember, here we have our SSD listeners. Well, what happens if we put a cochlear implant on them? Well, we immediately see a big effect and improvement in their ability to localize compared to the unaided condition. It's still different from normal, but it also maintains that widespread invariability that we saw with the unaided SSD listener. Interestingly, at least based on this data, what it would suggest is that it's also similar to a bilateral CI user, begging the question of two electrical ears versus a acoustic ear and electrical ear. There doesn't seem to be an added benefit of using an acoustic ear with an electrical ear over two electrical ears, at least based on this data. So interesting things to explore further with spatial hearing and SSD listeners. So let's jump to sound localization performance. These are studies going on in the lab currently by Seba and our postdoctoral fellow, John Sheets, specifically looking at SSD listeners. Here we have normal hearing performance in normal hearing listeners. And as we expect, we see really good performance demonstrated by plots along that diagonal line. We look at this across 3 different levels because we're trying to, particularly in SSD listeners, make sure that we're roving over at least 20 dB to accommodate that acoustic head shadow. But when we compare this to acquired SSDs, we immediately see that effect we expect, biasing towards the open ear or the better hearing ear in this condition. But when we look to the right, we see that when the signal gets a little bit louder, the behavior starts to change a little bit. They're starting to maybe make some decisions on both sides, on both the deafened ear and the acoustic ear. And we see the regression is starting to change a little bit. So what's contributing to this? Well, as we mentioned earlier, some monaural listeners can adapt to use spectral cues, monaural spectral cues, as well as loudness difference cues created by the acoustic head shadow to help infer where an object is in space. And so we think this might be what's happening in these listeners. So as an example of that, I'm going to show you some old data we have unpublished of a congenital listener. If you look at the RMS error and the mean absolute error, you immediately see that their error is very low, right? It's nothing close to that 60 degree of error that we saw in the Dorman paper or in our cross and bone conduction device users. And that, it's kind of falling around that diagonal line like we would like to see. And so why is that happening? When we separate this out, looking at high pass signals versus low pass signals, we see that the high pass signals are still well located, but the low pass signals result in this bias, right, between the 2 ears, suggesting that some listeners are able to adapt and remap to use high-pitched spectral cues or pinna cues to actually locate not just an elevation, but also an azimuth. And this is actually a fairly well-described phenomenon in auditory neuroscience, and one that we were interested in exploring to see, well, how quickly can someone do this? Does it require training? And does the ability to use these level cues and spectral cues affect how somebody might perform when we're testing them in the clinical environment? Recalling that now, as we increase our treatment of SSD listeners, there's an increasing interest in trying to find ways clinically to test this. But localization setups in clinics aren't like the lab, right? So they usually have a limited number of speakers, and there's no real criteria or guidelines around this. So people are using all different types of stimuli and approach to this. So what we did is we studied this using 5 different centers internationally. And the same setup just to see if we would get the same effect regardless of center. And we put normal hearing listeners in, and of course we see that they localize really, really well. And then what we did was we acutely plugged them and tested them. And when we acutely plugged them, we immediately see again this open ear bias where they're favoring the better hearing ear. But importantly, what we did again is we roved that signal over that 20 dB of head shadow. And so after this, we took a break, and most of the listeners would say, oh my goodness, this is so challenging. It was really hard. And we did what anybody would typically do in a clinical environment. We gave them a little bit of encouragement, and we said, don't worry, that's normal. You have a difference between your ears. Here, why don't you take a practice test to make you more comfortable? And we let them listen to the signal one more time. So we didn't provide any training, but we provided a little bit of a priori information and experience that would be common in the clinical environment. And then we retested them. But when we retested them, we, instead of roving the signal, we kept the signal at one level at 40 dBSL. And what you see happens is immediately in real time with no training, the listeners were able to adapt to use a level cue to approximate where that sound might be in space. And this, combined with a limited number of speakers, allows this forced choice option where patients might be able to use this level cue to really be very accurate, despite no access to binaural hearing in this condition. So the next thing we did is we tested them again immediately, no break. We said, great job, let's try it again. But we tricked them and we re-roved the signal. And what you see is when we re-rove the signal and we create some ambiguity in that level cue, this effect essentially goes away, right? They're no longer able to localize the signal well. But if you look closely, what you'll see is they're still actually using level. They're localizing the soft sounds to one side and the loud sounds to the other side, demonstrating without any real formal instruction or training that in real time listeners can start to use this unconsciously to help them determine where sounds are in space. So the key here is level is a really important factor. It's a robust cue for monoral listeners, and it's something to be mindful of when we're thinking about how we're interpreting data or how we're setting up to test benefit in these patients. So we wanted to also explore the spectral cue. So this is some work that that I did with my colleagues in the Netherlands, and we looked at what happens when we plug a normal hearing listener. And indeed, what we see again is that biased effect where they're locating all the sounds to one side. But if you look closely, what you'll see is on the better hearing ear side, they're actually still locating the signal with a good amount of accuracy. But it's really the poor hearing side or the plugged side that's no longer being well localized and the cue is being disrupted, suggesting they're using that spectral cue in real time to help make decisions on that better hearing ear side. We then added a device and we still see the same effect where they're able to well localize on that side, meaning those cues are still robust for them. But then what we decided to do to really determine if this was a spectral cue effect is then we molded the pinna, left the ear canal open and just molded the pinna to take away the pinna cues. And what you see is that they're no longer on that better hearing ear side able to well localize those signals. So again, monoral listeners can adapt to use these cues in the normal hearing ear to quell some of those spatial deficits. So back to the data of Seba and John. So we have those acquireds that I oriented you to the front. Looking again at another congenital SSD now in the new lab, and what we see is a similar effect to what we saw before. This listener is not nearly as good as our previous listener we looked at, but you do see that they are using some kind of strategy to make decisions where they're at least locating in the right and left hemifields, very different from their acquired counterpoints. But when we add the cochlear implant to this listening population, we see a significant benefit or gain over the congenital listener. Indeed, it's still not normal, and we do see that there's some different patterns with the different levels, suggesting that not everyone is benefiting the same with the CI, consistent with what others have reported in the literature. And here's just an example of that. This is some data put out by Ruth Latofsky and her group several years ago, I guess now, looking at acoustic versus acoustic plus CI and SSD listeners. And this is data from a lot of listeners, and the dark is the average responses of those listeners. But you'll see here, again, that pattern where in some cases, even in the unaided condition, it seems like they're doing relatively well and able to make some benefit. And when you add the CI, the mean difference doesn't change so much, but you see there's a reduction in that variability, meaning more listeners are gaining and benefiting. We also see some of this better hear listening effect here. So just demonstrating that this is not necessarily novel, but something important to consider. So the other thing we're interested in understanding is, well, what about speech and localization together, right? We don't do these things in isolation. Typically, if you're out at a restaurant, someone calls your name and there's a lot of noise in the environment, the first thing you're going to do is turn and orient yourself to that talker to improve the SNR so you can maintain the conversation. And so we wanted to look at this. What we did is we presented sentences with competing talkers. This is just a subset of the data in the interest of time, looking just at normal hearers and our SSD plus CI listeners. And what we did is we told them they had to locate the target talker and repeat back what they said. And we see that, this even in the normal hearing listeners is harder than it is when we just have to localize a broadband noise. But indeed, they do it very well, right? They're really able to do it very well, compared to our SSD CI listeners, where we saw them really have this robust shift and change, appearing to look closer to normal. Now, when we make the task more complex, we see that it's really challenging for them. So kind of demonstrating that gap between the gold standard of normal hearing with normal binaural hearing and electric and acoustic hearing. This is really still exists for our listeners. Also, too, we start to see that there's, maybe a little bit of a better ear effect here on this side. So suggesting that perhaps as the signal gets harder, they start to become more reliant again on that better ear and allow it to dominate more or be preferential in how they're listening. This figure to the right is actually the correct. So how well were they able to repeat the words? And what you'll see here too is, again, this better ear effect. When it's on the better side, they do great. When it moves to the other side, the groups get poorer. But our cochlear implant group in red is doing better than our acquired or congenitals compared to those acquired and congenitals. But this effect really only seems to be very robust at a high SNR. Which is not inconsistent with what others have demonstrated in the literature, is that you really need an SNR of probably above 6 to really demonstrate or gain the benefit of a cochlear implant. So what about this better ear listening effect? You really see this in conditions where the speech is in front of the noise, or the speech is in front of the listener and noise is directed at the cochlear implant. Because the better ear has a direct line to the source, recalling that the brain's reliance on the better SNR that we discussed earlier. And so here's a good example of this from the literature. Starting on the right, this is from our colleagues in Freiburg. They looked at a signal-to-noise ratio that would be required to understand speech for the normal hearing condition, the cochlear implant listening condition alone, and then when the normal ear and the cochlear implant were combined, or the SSD plus CI condition. And they looked at this across different listening configurations. And what you will see is that in the SSD plus CI, performance is not significantly different from the best ear condition. Similarly, when looking at spatial release for masking on the left here, they demonstrated there was no significant difference from the cochlear implant condition to the best monaural condition. And so what they concluded is that the results of their spatial release for masking and binaural summation measures don't support the idea that there's binaural processing of the two monaural inputs to improve speech and noise perception beyond that which is observed in the best monaural hearing condition, or what the best monaural ear provides. And in fact, that the cochlear implant plus SSD patients are using a selective better ear listening strategy. Whereas in contrast, the normal hearing control group showed evidence of binaural processing in the form of a strongly increased spatial release for masking when using both ears rather than one. So this is another really exciting study. If you guys are unfamiliar with it, we have a lack of longitudinal data in general, I think, in implantable populations, but in children, this is really important. So this is a group from our colleagues in Belgium who are studying longitudinally the effects of cochlear implants in children with single-sided deafness and the impact of their development, which still remains, I think, a bit unclear. And so they took a young group of prelingually deafened SSD children who received a cochlear implant at an early age. And then starting at age 4, they assessed their spatial hearing skills, including speech perception and noise and sound localization. And then they compared them to different groups, a group of children with SSD with no cochlear implant, and then a children with SSD using a cochlear implant with and without their device. And then these groups were then compared to a normal hearing control group. And so what they found was that there was no difference across groups for speech front, speech front noise to the deaf ear, but there was a significant gain with speech, as expected, was directed at the deaf ear, and noise was masking the good ear. But when the talker is in front of the listener, there's no difference across groups, supporting the previous study that we just discussed, that CI is not contributing more to the monaural ear alone for speech and noise in these conditions. And so when we think about spatial hearing for SSD and how we determine benefit, these findings raise a lot of questions about the clinical speech measures that we're using to determine spatial hearing benefit in our patients. Excitingly, they're also studying localization, which everybody from my lab can attest is not easy in kids. So kudos to them. So they here are looking at, again, these same groups. So in black, we have the controls, the normal hearing controls, which are doing really well. Again, remember, the lower the error, the further to the bottom of the graph they are, compared to the different SSD groups. And, you know, what you can quickly see is that for those SSD listeners who are not using a treatment, there's no real gain over time. And they don't move out of chance performance, but the ones who have an SSD, some of them appear to be improving with time. Although, like in our normal hearing adults, don't seem to approach normal localization performance. So this is a study really to keep an eye out for, because it remains to be seen, right? You know, we could immediately expect, well, Performance with the cochlear implant typically plateaus at about 6 months to a year, so it's unlikely that these children will demonstrate improved localization abilities, but factors like just maturation and their ability to perform the task might also play a role. You'll see some of these kids up here are not really changing over time. Is this because they're still too young and they're not able to do the task? Or will it be that some children won't show much of a benefit and others will show more? Is this about the programming of the devices? A lot of questions remain, but really exciting and interesting data coming on how cochlear implants will affect the development of spatial hearing in children. And so what does this mean for clinical decision making, right? The question is, if this can happen, and some listeners will make use of these cues to facilitate spatial hearing ability, others will not. Some have high disability, some have low disability. How do we predict who is going to benefit and which devices we should be using? And the challenge is that even if we control for every factor, right, all of these things, etiology, duration of deafness, age, time to intervention, only really accounts for 22% of the variability in CI listeners in general. And then we combine this with the limitations that we have in our implantable device study designs, right? We have a lot of intersubject variability across these studies. They're plagued by small samples, selection bias, typically trying one device first before you move to a surgical intervention. It's a necessary selection bias, but it does influence outcomes to some degree. And of course, the limited longitudinal studies that we have. So the things we really want to be considering is looking at these behavioral patterns, right? If we look at the behavioral patterns of localization versus just averaged responses, it can really provide us the most robust information at the individual level on how listeners are using and potentially integrating cues from a cochlear implant into the normal hearing ear. It's more likely that with the input from the cochlear implant, the listeners are better able to use these high frequency level cues, right? We know that that is more well retained than the timing cues in a cochlear implant, and that this might be helping them to better lateralize the signal. Now, even just lateralization, even just the ability to say, yes, it's on the right or yes, it's on the left and be accurate about that, probably provides these listeners a significant benefit, because again, if they can be accurate and if it's on the right or left, they can appropriately orient themselves towards the target to improve the signal to noise ratio by using that better ear effect. And this really might be the key important difference in electrical stimulation over rerouting, because with rerouting, there's no accuracy in their ability to even determine right from left, which means they're only going to really show those benefits from rerouting in spatially separated, controlled listening and noise configurations. But all of this leads to a number of different questions. Specifically, can we train patients to better exploit these cues? So as we wrap up here, the final things I just kind of wanted to leave you with is from the talk today is, binaural hearing is critically important for auditory spatial perception. It enables us to rapidly identify cues and sounds in space, enables us to respond to subtle changes in the auditory environment. And this is really dependent on, again, the integration of the binaural timing and level cues between the two ears to actively map where we are in space, right? So again, as that environment changes dynamically around us and becomes more complex and the signals overlap, this binaural hearing ability is what enables us to, without even thinking about it, unconsciously, with very little effort, continue to adapt to perform well regardless of the environment. But SSD listeners are not able to leverage these cues for sound localization or acoustic scene analysis of complex scenes, right? But they may be able, in some listeners, to leverage some monaural, spectral, or level difference cues to at least help them make some decisions. And maybe those who are able to do that are those patients who may have less disability or choose not to move into a device versus the ones who actively seek treatment and report high levels of handicap and disability. I think it's important to remember too from the talk today that speech perception impairment really depends on the spatial configuration for these listeners. So their handicap and disability varies widely. If it's a quiet environment or the talker is located at their better hearing ear, we are going to expect them to report low handicap and disability, right? It's not until they have to start really relying on these binaural hearing cues that handicap and disability is going to really emerge and become important. And so depending on their lifestyle, depending on a lot of different factors, this is going to vary in patients or vary by situation, most importantly. Rerouting devices like cross devices or bone conduction devices can improve speech perception in quiet and in noise for certain spatial configurations, but they do not restore hearing in the deaf ear. So they're not able to provide any binaural benefits, including and most specifically sound source localization. Whereas CI does restore some auditory function to the deaf ear through direct electrical stimulation to that auditory nerve, which can restore some of the benefits of hearing with two ears, including speech perception and noise, the ability to segregate sounds, and the ability to localize where speech is coming from. And so with that, I will say thank you to you for your time and your attention. I want to thank again everybody who works with me in the lab and all of our collaborators across the university. We've been very fortunate to collaborate with a number of different departments, most specifically biomedical engineering, which has really created some exciting work in our department, which is fantastic. We're very thankful to our patients. It's without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but our lab is actually right on the clinical floor. So we're able to enact with them every day, which creates just, again, a fun clinical research environment for us. Our hearing implant program, our cochlear implant audiologists are integral to our ability to do this, and they're huge supporters of the work that we do. And without them and helping us to recruit our patients, we wouldn't be able to do this. And of course, the Department of Otolaryngology, our chair, Dr. Fred Talishi, our funding agencies. And if you're interested, you can use this QR code here to access all the references that were used in today's talk to go read up more about it. And with that, I'll take a pause, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.